One. Hello and welcome everybody to the latest edition of Planted Unearthed. My name's Sam Peters and I'm one of the founding partners at Planted, the first contemporary design show aimed at reconnecting cities with nature. Back in March, we began a series of conversations with some of the world's leading experts in their respective fields, exploring how design, sustainability, food and nature can combine to create cleaner, greener, healthier urban spaces. We've had some fantastic feedback on our thought-provoking discussions, and I'm delighted to report Planted Unearthed will be continuing through the summer and beyond. Today, it's my privilege to welcome two of the brightest young talents on the UK design scene. Manijeh Verghese and Madeleine Kessler founded Unscene Architecture together in 2019, and next year will co-curate the British Pavilion at the 17th Venice Architecture Biennale. Manijeh and Madeleine, welcome to Planted Unearthed.
Thanks, Sam. It's great to be here.
Yeah.
It's great to have you guys here. I mean, I'm really lucky to be able to speak to some great people as part of this Planted Unearthed series, but I'm really looking forward to speaking to you guys because I've spoken to you in the past and you know what the work you guys are doing. It's a real sort of something that I'm really passionate about. So I'm really interested to hear more about it. I'm sure the viewers are too. But so perhaps, Manijeh, perhaps could you start us off with just tell us a little bit about Unscene Architecture and what you're trying to achieve, really?
Sure. So Maddie and I founded Unscene as a kind of practice that would operate across different scales and disciplines to reveal the unseen forces that shape our cities and spaces. And we're quite keen to work with local communities in terms of allowing them to participate in the conversation around kind of what public space should be or how they use their spaces. And I think our idea behind the practice is to provide a platform for design, research, consultation, and curation in order to provoke this wider conversation about the city. And it's really important to us that this is done through action rather than just words. So the kind of first project that our practice has been looking at is titled The Garden of Privatised Delights, which is the exhibition that we'll be doing at the British Pavilion in Venice. And this really explores the concept of privatized public space across towns and cities in the UK, as well as kind of more rural areas. And we're quite keen to kind of work across the public and private sectors and explore the role of the architect as a facilitator of these kinds of conversations that bring different decision makers around a table to have a conversation.
Maddie, can you tell us a little bit more about the project that Manijeh just touched on? I mean, why is it so important to explore this space, this idea of private space or formerly public space, which has become private? Why does this mean so much to you guys?
Yeah, so the Garden of Privatised Delights, we took inspiration from a painting by Hieronymus Bosch called The Garden of Earthly Delights, which is set up as a triptych, looking at sort of heaven, hell, and then the middle ground of earth in between. And that's kind of how we see privatised public space. Like often you have this very polarised debate of private land being bad, public land being good, but actually we're all living in this kind of weird in between. And so we really want to engage with that middle ground. And so within the pavilion, we're sort of exploring things like the pub, the high street, garden squares, as well as looking at how we can engage with policy to really change these kinds of spaces and open them up so that they become more accessible. I think the past few months have really shown us the importance of a lot of these types of spaces like the pub and the high street and how important it is to try and save them. And it's not just about the kind of monetary uses behind them, but it's the social uses, the conversations that people have. It's the kind of social exchange and these kind of things that we're really interested in looking at how do we sort of protect them, but also encourage them going forward.
It looks like to me like perhaps the pub or the public house, of course, which it's short for, perhaps has never been under more threat. Is that a fair thing to say?
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. I think.
I think the past few years it's been under threat anyway, and now with what's been happening around COVID, even more so. And we've been particularly interested in the pub for years. Like originally, sort of 2015, we taught a summer school together all about the pub, looking at how the pub is sort of modern day public toilets. It's the extension of your living room, but up and down the country, it's closing down. And what does that actually mean to communities, both in rural areas and in cities? and therefore how can we start to reinvent the pub and redefine it as something that's more than just a place for drinking, because like that's sort of actually quite a minor part of what a pub is. And I think what's been happening for the past few months has really shown the importance of ensuring we protect these places and we don't just allow them to shut and become converted into residential uses.
It's also a really important part of the project to look at interior spaces. I think often people think of privatized public space as being exterior or being a new type of space that's often like a paved square in a new development. But actually spaces like the pub and the high street are embedded in British culture over time. And actually, like, given that the weather isn't always so great here, it's really important for us to think about these interior spaces. And as Maddie mentioned, in like kind of light of the whole situation with coronavirus, when the weather starts to get worse, like what are we going to do when we don't necessarily have the outdoor space to kind of meet and come together? And what kind of solutions or alternatives can we find? I think the whole situation has highlighted a lot of inequalities in society, but spaces like the pub and the high street that were already under threat are now even worse off and may not be able to reopen. So it's definitely a moment where we need kind of investment from probably both the private and the public sectors in order to save these kinds of spaces.
I mean, Manijeh, have you imagined the sort of pub of the future as such? I mean, how could it look? I mean, social distancing is going to play a huge role, and you know, I've grown up through my early adult life and university, and then as I left university, but going to pretty crowded, hectic pubs, you go to the bar, and there's lots of people shouting to get served, and they probably feel like a different age in many ways to where we're at now in terms of the spacing that we've got to keep apart, and no doubt that will have a knock-on effect. I mean, what does the future of public space and pubs in particular look like?
I think for the pubs that have opened so far, they've had to make a lot of changes quite quickly in terms of introducing one-way systems, ensuring that there's enough space. So it's usually pubs that have outdoor space that have been able to reopen in a safe way. They've been trying to use table service and really think about circulation. But I think for us, even before any of this happened, when we were looking at the pub, we were really keen to explore the role of the architect and how pubs, as Maddie said previously, can go beyond just being a space for drinking. Like even in our own experience, we've often thought of the pub as all sorts of different things that provide functions for people in a specific community. So like a living room, waiting room, etc. And so how do we actually design in to the pub kind of spaces for different activities and make it a bit more of a flexible space that can accommodate different types of user groups? And I think with the added dimension of social distancing, we need to think about like kind of access to outdoor space or a bit more room for people to actually come together in a safe way.
Yeah, I think that when we look at the pub for the future, like I think maybe we do have the short-term effects of social distancing, but one would hope that in the long term, like we won't have to socially distance, in 5 years' time or something. And there's kind of other things that we also need to consider, which we've had to consider for a number of years about the future of the pub. And I suppose it's kind of that urgency of ensuring that we kind of find a way forward for it.
That's really interesting, guys, and really important for lots of people who hold the pub close to their heart, that's for sure. And moving to sort of slightly related space, but not quite the same, but in terms of just talking about accessibility to land in general in the UK, but specifically in England, if I may actually just talk to you guys about England and why it's different, what is different to other parts of the United Kingdom, particularly Scotland, in terms of the accessibility to land. Can you talk a bit about that, guys? Perhaps Maddie, if you go first, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously in Scotland you've got the right to roam, which you don't have in England, which makes us much more kind of having to abide by land ownership rules. And we're really interested in this research project by Guy Shrubsole and Anna Powell-Smith called Who Owns England? Amazing website you can go to, where they've been looking at how do you actually make land ownership more transparent, because unless land is registered on the land registry, actually you can't publicly, like the general public don't know who owns that piece of land, which is a really big problem. And And when they started the project, only 50% of all land was actually documented on the Land Registry's website. Now it's around 85%, but that's still 25% of land that's not actually registered. So the public don't have knowledge of who owns it. And that sort of equates to about 5.2 million acres. And so even when it is actually registered on the website, it's not necessarily attributed to a particular owner. Often when you click on it, you'll see that it's owned by like landholding companies abroad, offshore companies. And that's a really big problem, that the general public just have no knowledge of who even owns the land around them. And if you want to change something in your community, or you want to have a say, like one of the first things is to know who to even talk to, or who even owns that piece of land.
So let me get this straight. Let me just check that if I could. 5.2 million acres of England, or the UK of England? It's essentially unattributed, and the public don't know.
I have a feeling it's England and Wales.
England and Wales, I think. Yeah. Okay, but still a massive amount of land. And Manijeh, perhaps if you could explain what I mean, this is about transparency, this is about community, how communities interact, about democracy, isn't it? Is that too strong?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely about democracy. I think one of the problems with not understanding who owns land is it also prevents you from understanding what you can actually do on what looks like public space, but often isn't. So when we started looking at privatized public space, I think one of the main case studies was Paternoster Square, which during the Occupy movement, people didn't know it looked like public space. And I mean, obviously, there's the right to protest in public space, but then only when the protesters tried to occupy Paternoster Square did they realize that it was privately owned by the Mitsubishi Corporation, and so they were removed from the site. And it's because of things like this that actually the Greater London Authority has been developing a public London Charter, which will for the first time start to regulate the rights and responsibilities for kind of owners, users and managers of privatized public space. So it just means that, you no longer, at the moment, this is a kind of a space without legislation. So it, for all intents and purposes, was private land. Whereas now, if it looks public, it will be kind of governed by rules that actually mean it's accessible to the public. So the big problem with this kind of space is access, really, like and being more aware of your rights and what you can do in these kinds of spaces.
Because at the moment, there's a really big problem that you don't actually know you've broken the rules until you've broken them. Like often they're not transparent. And I think the public space charter is really interesting in how it's trying to ensure that all these spaces actually abide by really similar regulations, and that some regulations that we might not agree with, like actually aren't morally right, sort of don't get implemented just randomly by a landowner.
So I'm going to ask you guys a couple of test questions here, if I can. And sorry, I didn't flag these up before the call, but they've just come to mind. But so I'm planning a camping trip, as I'm sure quite a few people around the UK and indeed around the world because of travel restrictions. And actually, I'd say before that, my wife and I decided we were going to holiday in the UK more and more a long time ago for a variety of reasons. But we've got beautiful countryside. Obviously, everyone should respect the countryside and respect wherever they go, indeed, and take away anything that they certainly not leave anything behind and leave no trace. But just say, for example, I've got some tracks out the back of my house, and there's a nice wood up there, and I'm not exactly sure who owns it. I think there's some degree of open access there, but can I just go and pitch a tent up there this weekend?
Well, I mean, that's where the whole transparency thing comes into play. It depends who owns the land, what their rules over their land is. Yeah, I mean, it kind of really highlights the whole issue of not knowing who owns the land and therefore what the rules and regulations are on that piece of land.
I mean, it's a whole fascinating project in and of itself to look at the signage that you find, especially in kind of more rural green spaces. And it is at the discretion of the landowner to determine the rules currently. And it could be anything from them being completely fine with you pitching a tent on their site to actually threatening you or, forcing you off the land or even harming you because technically it's their property. So that's the kind of one of the biggest problems.
It would be an amazing project to do, like, in itself, just going around the UK, seeing like where you can actually camp and where you can't, and who kicks you off. And like there are like a lot of really interesting mapping projects that we are interested in. Like, someone started to map publicly accessible toilets, for example, like where you can actually access a toilet that might appear publicly accessible, or you know, is in a private landowner's space. But we've been speaking as well to this really interesting PhD student from Central St Martin's called Adriana Cobo, and she has been looking at, in Granary Square in King's Cross, sort of how far you can push the rules. And so she started doing her laundry in the fountains, for example. And it didn't take very long until people had started tweeting about it, and she got sort of told to stop doing her laundry. And the whole recording of a conversation of them being like, you know, what are you actually doing? And she's like, I'm doing my laundry. Well, do you live locally? No. And as soon as she was a student, it was fine. But until she was a student, it wasn't fine. And I think, you know, like, testing these rules and what actually happens is really fascinating.
I mean, I think that what's important is, I mean, for us, it's never been about this kind of black and white view of private being bad and public being good. I think throughout the project, and also in all our kind of different projects and talks we've done since, it's really important that people stop seeing it as a binary issue, because actually a lot of privatized public space has been opened up to the public for the very first time and wouldn't otherwise be accessible. And the private sector has funding to kind of maintain and support these spaces that the public sector no longer really does. And there's a nostalgia for this time where the state kind of supported everything, which weirdly we find ourselves in right now because of coronavirus. But I think we need to like look at bringing the kind of public and private sector to the table more often. I mean, there are quite a lot of public-private partnerships happening at the moment, but they're not necessarily the norm. And I think that's something we're keen to encourage.
I was just going to say, I mean, that's key to all things, isn't it? When you're trying to affect change, is to bring everyone with you. There's nothing to be gained by kind of polarizing positions, and probably there's a huge amount of middle ground in that. For somewhere like King's Cross, which is a space that we know incredibly well, it's a beautiful area, really sensitively designed, and Dan Pearson had a big part to play in that whole Granary Square development. It's a really great space to be, obviously, but I'm sure there's conversations that could be had where even perhaps more access was given, and actually spaces could look even better with the help of the public. So it's a really interesting conversation for everyone to have together, I guess. I mean, just in simple terms, guys, could I ask you, Manijeh, just about you know, we're obviously a big strapline for us, or a big sort of commitment for us, Planted, is to reconnect cities with nature, but also more broadly reconnect people with nature. They're one and the same thing. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the difference and how your ability to access nature is often determined by your wealth, or your essentially your wealth?
Yeah, so it's, I think, if you look specifically at like cities in the UK, especially those that developed in the Georgian period, so like London, Bristol, Bath, they have a lot of these gated squares or garden squares. And they were often kind of developed as part of the fact that like people were living in denser urban areas. So instead of having a private garden, you had a shared private garden in the center of a kind of enclave of houses. And the problem with that was that, like, I think nowadays, as the city has evolved, often these houses are no longer even inhabited by private individuals, and they're these amazing green spaces that are completely cut off from most of the public being able to access them. And I think especially when you live in a city, you really want access to green space, and more accommodation has like smaller and smaller footprints. So I think one of the things we've been looking at in the pavilion is how we can open up these spaces and kind of remove some of the barriers to access, both physical, like the railings that surround them, but also the invisible barriers such as wealth and privilege that kind of prevent people from feeling like they can actually go into these spaces and use them. And too often, I think it goes back to this thing of like the individual's agency over what they can do in a space. And on these railings, you often find a whole catalog of signs saying like what is allowed or what's not allowed rather than what's allowed to do. And you're not allowed to bring dogs in there, you're not allowed to spend time in there outside of the kind of hours of operation. Only key holders can often access this. And so it's something we've been interested in for a while, to really question like the rules that govern these spaces and why it's so important to keep these private and not to allow the general public in.
I mean, I touched on this concept of leave no trace, and how people should respect wherever they go, whatever they create, any rubbish or litter they should obviously take with them, and respect where they are. That sort of goes without saying in some ways, but there's a big education piece here to be done as well, isn't there, around kind of where people can go, where they can't go, and then for once people are educated and can really understand this subject, which is, as you guys have both rightly pointed out, it's sort of hidden away. It's hard to understand because it's not communicated, this problem. So I guess once you guys are obviously a big part of that process. I mean, in terms of maybe just, and appreciate your time, guys, but in terms of the sort of historic context to this, I mean, how did we get here? Like, why is this? Why are we such a sort of carved up, fenced off, inaccessible country?
Yeah, I mean, it is a historic thing as well. Like you've like, I mean, that's something that we're really interested in. Like it's really embedded in our history. Like the garden squares, like they go back, to Georgian times, and that's like now embedded in our urban grain. Like, these decisions about the city or about our spaces, they become embedded for generations to come. And it still happens in developments. Like last year, The Guardian highlighted a development in South London which had just been built, where sort of the children in the affordable units of the development weren't allowed to use the play space of those who were living in the market rental and market accommodation. And it's just it's really, yeah, it's actually still happening today, this kind of segregation.
There's an amazing book by Brett Christophers called The New Enclosure that tracks the history of privatization in the UK and our kind of obsession to own land and, as you say, to like carve it up into these like chunks of territory. And it goes back to like the Enclosure Acts of the 18th century, where it was because of landowners needing to like farm their lands and then also make sure that like they could like not necessarily lose their rights to tenants. And so it's something that goes all the way back, and then it kind of tracks the kind of evolution of this alongside a political history, because unbeknownst to the public, the government has been selling off like public land for decades now. And I think that's how we got into the situation of not necessarily understanding who owns our land, but also so much of it now is owned by foreign investors. And it takes projects like the Who Owns England that has been hours and hours of time of submitting freedom of information requests and testing the boundaries of what you can do in a space in order to gather together a database of knowledge that can be made accessible to the public.
And I think it goes down to really short-term thinking and like short-term strategies about our land ownership in our cities. And even yesterday, just the announcement about being able to just build houses without planning, for example, like what does that actually really mean? Like that sounds disastrous. And I think it's like a series of very short-term decisions and policies that are made. It's not any sort of one factor, but it's I think we need to sort of all come together from all different sectors and have a really strategic like long-term ambition and goal that we work towards. And a lot of what we found is talking to people who you think would be like worlds apart or very polarized, actually like a lot of our goals are aligned. Like we do all want to see our cities improve, and most people do want to see a more equitable society.
That's a great place to finish there, Madeleine. Thank you both so much, guys. It's really fascinating. I could sit here and talk to you both all day. So that just leaves it for me to say that if you've enjoyed today's edition of Planted Unearthed, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, details of which can be found on our website, www.planted-cities.co.uk. We've got more great content to come in the next few weeks, including news of the Exciting Talks programme, chaired by Planted's very own sustainability guru, Oliver Heath, which we're planning ahead of the London Design Week. But for me, for now, it's thanks again to Madeleine and Manijeh, and thanks to you for watching. My name's Sam Peters, and this has been Planted Unearthed.